Morning. So, I was on Twitter earlier today and saw something from a tweet from Tim Pool. He basically said something to the effect of red flag laws are stop and frisk on steroids. Which was kind of a typical Tim Pool law enforcement related big brain take. I like Tim. I'm a fan, especially when it comes to law enforcement, though. I think he's got a huge blind spot. He tries to be fair, and usually he's pretty reasonable about it, but he does not like police, which is fine. He's had some bad experiences, and I think that really colors his interpretation of law enforcement related stuff, which is fine. He's had some cops on the show before, and I think that's maybe been useful to kind of temper his view on things at times, but he falls into the trap that many people fall into of just speaking out of ignorance on something they don't understand. Which isn't to say that Tim doesn't work very hard to try and educate himself on a variety of subjects, and I mean, his job is he's a talking head, right? He's a commentator. That's what he does. And so you tune in, you watch his take on things, just like I'm giving my take on things, and that's fine, that's valid. I just I wish he would get a little more perspective on this at times. I've done a video previously on stop and frisk, so I won't get too into the weeds on that, but the comparison, I think, is profoundly unhelpful. I mean, they're actually two very different things. When you talk about stop and frisk, and I'll link the previous video I did on community policing, broken windows, stop and frisk, because I talk a bit about the idea, and try to differentiate it a little bit from like the very specific NYPD program and like Terry v. Ohio generally. And if you're not familiar with Terry v. Ohio, and you're wanting to discuss this topic, that is one of a number of landmark cases that you should understand. But basically, Terry v. Ohio carved out the reasonable suspicion provision in law enforcement, right? Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable search and seizure, right? And then no warrant shall issue except, upon oath or affirmation, or a warrant issued, right, supported by oath or affirmation, and probable cause, right? So when we talk about stop and frisk and the ability of police to temporarily detain somebody under reasonable suspicion, right? The court says, if you have reasonable suspicion, if you've got a set of specific articulable facts that lead to the reasonable subjective belief that a crime is occurring, has occurred, or is about to occur, the police can stop somebody for a reasonable amount of time and make reasonable inquiries about whatever their observations are, right? So this is not authority to arrest, but it is authority to stop and make inquiry, right? That's what we're talking about with Terry v. Ohio. When we're talking about red flag laws, and that's kind of a catch-all term, we're a patchwork of 50 states, okay? And there's no Supreme Court decision like Terry v. Ohio that's analogous to red flag laws. We don't have any national red flag laws as far as I'm aware, but we have state red flag laws. And so the one I'm familiar with is the one in Oregon. I haven't gone and looked at other red flag laws, and I'd imagine they are not all created equally, but we're talking about, in my experience, in my context, red flag laws. And I understand they're very unpopular among people who are pro Second Amendment, and I understand why, but functionally what we're talking about is an emergency protection order, not dissimilar from a restraining order or from a stalking order, right? And I'll link, there's actually a petition form provided on the, I think, the State Attorney General's website for Oregon, that somebody can fill out if they're applying for an extreme risk protection order, or, you know, an Oregon red flag protection order, right? And if you look at this form, I think it's actually pretty telling, right? So the people that can apply for an extreme risk protection order are A, immediate household members, and B, members of law enforcement, right? And so the critique with Pro 2A folks, and again, this is Oregon specific, so I can't speak to other states, but in this case, right, you don't have random members of government or, you know, anti-gun rights activists necessarily able to just go out and red flag Joe Citizen on the basis of, you know, political animus, right? And if you go through the form, you know, it wants to know who you are, right? And then specific facts, right? We talked about specific articulable facts, right? Like, what specific incidents of violence have occurred? Explain. What specific crimes has, you know, the person committed? Explain. What specific concerns about mental health or, you know, suicidality do you have? Explain. Has the person violated a restraining order or protection order previously? Explain. Right, and then have they made recent gun purchases? Which, you know, that's probably going to irk a lot of people. But if you have all those things previously and they're going out and buying guns that they maybe don't already have, are those reasonable grounds for concern, right? And so, I mean, you can like or dislike the form, and then maybe the form needs to change, but like in theory, on paper, when we look at this red flag law and how it looks outwardly, just, you know, based on my kind of cursory analysis of it, like I said, it's not functionally dissimilar from restraining orders, right? And so I guess you have to ask yourself then, like, if this is functionally similar, right, do you have a problem with restraining orders and stalking orders, right? Now, is there opportunity for abuse of the restraining order process? Yes, absolutely. And I can't tell you the number of times that somebody goes and obtains a restraining order, or you get dueling restraining orders from both sides, and then things calm down, they don't bother to get the restraining order rescinded, and they continue to cohabitate or spend time together extensively until they get drunk, they have a fight, and one party calls the police on another person, and you get this kind of cyclical arrest cycle for this individual who's got a restraining order because they fight, they make up, and then they call the police again. You know, there are individuals who I've arrested multiple times on the basis of restraining orders, right? So can they be abused? Absolutely. Anything could be abused. And to be sure, some things are more rife for abuse than others. But you can think about, like, with a restraining order, what is the intrusion on your rights, okay? Because there is a significant intrusion. And people don't realize, okay, if you get a restraining order served on you, you cannot be within 1,000 yards of the protected party, their residence, their place of work. And I mean, if this is somebody you've been in a long-term relationship with, it's a de facto eviction, right? So the state is, you know, saying you now have to move out. Now, there's a process to challenge the restraining order, just as there's a process to challenge an extreme risk protection order, a red flag protection order. But, I mean, functionally, you get evicted immediately, and then it's a non-discretionary arrest if you violate it. That is to say, if the police develop probable cause that you violated a restraining order, the law says the officer shall arrest. Now, anytime there's a shall arrest in law, what that is saying is an officer is culpable if they do not effect the arrest. They don't have discretion. They don't get to decide that they're not going to make this arrest today, and they can face some sort of culpability if they fail to do so, if they develop probable cause. So non-discretionary arrest for violations of restraining order, right? So it's a fairly significant intrusion into somebody's civil liberties, right? And where they can go, who can they associate with. It's pretty fundamental stuff, just like your right to keep and bear arms or your right to self-defense, right? And what's the constitutional backstop for those abuses? Well, it's the judiciary, right? And in the same way that somebody applying for an extreme risk protection order, a person who applies for a restraining order has to fill out a petition. It's a sworn statement that goes before a judge, and the judge examines it and says, do we have reasonable grounds? Again, this word reasonable keeps coming up, to, basically, seize this person, or, it seize their liberty in some way, or seize their property in some way, right? And that is where we get this concept of due process, right? Yes, you have constitutional rights. Yes, they're just incredibly important. But there are times when there are injunctions, that there's disruptions in your civil liberties. And we have a judicial review, a court process, that determines, when and how that can happen, typically, whether it's the issuance of a warrant or a restraining order or a red flag extreme risk protection order. And then, like I said, you've got the opportunity within, I believe, 30 days to challenge it in court. And so, again, it's burdensome. There's no denying that. You have to go hire an attorney who specializes in this area of law and go try and fight this emergency protection order. In the meantime, you are compelled by a court order signed by a judge to surrender your firearms. Or in the case of a restraining order, you're compelled to vacate the residence in which you may be living in, and avoid contact with this person, any third party contact, by electronic communication or anything else, right? So again, there's an infringement on somebody's liberties, but what is it accomplishing, right? So, and I deal with restraining orders far more often than I can't think of a time that I've had some sort of involvement with a extreme risk protection order, which isn't to say I wouldn't, but just I haven't had to deal with one yet. But restraining orders, gosh, those are super common. Tons of people have them. You'd be surprised. And generally speaking, once one gets served, the vast majority of the time, people respect the terms of the restraining order. And it's merely a piece of paper. Like there are certainly cases where stalkers or domestic abusers, people who are subject to those restraining or stalking orders, violate them, right? There's only the enforcement action on the back end if they violate it, right? There's no physical restraint associated with the restraining order. It's just a piece of paper, other than, again, compelling somebody to vacate their residence. But whether they honor or observe that court order, it depends entirely by the person, right? So it largely, my observation has been that restraining orders perform their function as intended. Have I seen examples of people abusing them? That is to say, they're using them lawfully, but have weaponized them for whatever, personal beef they have? Yes, absolutely. Do I foresee that happening with these extreme risk protection orders? Yes. Just with any other aspect of law, there's the potential that somebody is going to try and weaponize it against you. And in this case, it's going to have to be either A, law enforcement, or B, an immediate member of your household. You get into this question, do you want to risk, potentially domestic abuse, murders, suicides, with these firearms that you're trying to seize in the interest of not having people used, have them applied against them in a malicious manner, that's a conversation we can have, but to kind of come full circle to this thing Tim Pool said, that it's stop and frisk on steroids. Like, and his objection to stop and frisk is that, you know, he believes the Second Amendment gives you a blanket right to, you know, keep and bear arms. And so, you know, the fact that you are potentially armed and you're getting an exterior pat down, he finds that objectionable because there are certain, you know, gun control measures in a lot of places like New York City that otherwise create, you know, criminal carry scenarios that constitutionally he disagrees with, and I can see that. Oregon's a constitutional carry state. I mean, to carry concealed, you've got to have a permit, but I mean, you can open carry in Oregon. So I guess that it's unhelpful comparing it to Terry v. Ohio, because Terry v. Ohio doesn't have the constitutional backstop of the judiciary, right? It's very different in its functionality, and it does allow for due process, right? In a way that maybe Terry v. Ohio would not, because of the immediacy of the interaction, right? I mean, if you've got an immediate officer safety concern about an armed person right in front of you who you can articulate is, you know, a potential threat to you, and you can, you know, articulate why you believe they're armed and they're, you know, potentially engaged in criminal activity, like, you don't have the luxury of bringing that before a judge. Like, you're just going to have to act on the situation, and then you either find something that, you know, helps you develop probable cause, and then you bring them before a magistrate, charge them with crime, or you set them free, right? And so that Terry v. Ohio is completely different functionally from, again, this sworn statement, this petition that goes before a judge is reviewed by a judge, and how oftentimes things like restraining orders, I'd imagine these extreme risk protection orders, get denied by the judiciary because there's not enough there. It's not reasonable, and you know, largely I think whether or not these get abused more or less is going to depend on that judicial aspect of it, right? Whether or not you have a judge who maybe is a partisan, an activist, doesn't like guns, is just going to kind of, you know, pencil whip every single extreme risk protection order that comes in front of them, or, you know, whether they're going to do their due diligence and you know, make, you know, findings as far as, you know, whether or not there's sufficient fact pattern to justify suspending somebody's rights in that way. You know, and I don't have any direct experience with, you know, a judge reviewing that. I would love to talk to one who has and understand, like, what criteria they're actually looking at. And I don't know if they've got any statutory criteria they're supposed to look at, or how much discretion they have. You know, I've just kind of taken a cursory look at the law and how the process would work from my end. But yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on the issue, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think red flag laws are a problem? Do you like them? I don't know. Drop a comment below. Push back on me. It's okay. If you don't like what I have to say on the issue, I'd expect there's a number of people who've watched my videos that would not like red flag laws, and I can't say I blame them. But I'd love to hear from you. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. It's been fun, inspiring, and uplifting as always. We'll see you on the next one.